The empire that for 3 centuries defined the eastern limit of the Caesar's world has been deliberately misplaced in history. What if the power that shattered the legions of Crassus and humbled Mark Antony was not a mere barbarian horde, but a sophisticated and resilient civilization whose legacy was so profound it had to be intentionally obscured? We have been taught to see a world divided between the light of the Greco-Roman West and the supposed despotism of the Persian East. But what if this is a false dichotomy, a narrative crafted by the victors? We must become archaeologists of memory, sifting through the hostile propaganda of their Roman enemies and the calculated neglect of their Persian successors. We must listen for a sound different from the marching of legions, the thunder of hooves on the vast Eurasian steppe, the whisper of silk being traded in forgotten caravan cities, and the twang of 1,000 bowstrings that heralded the end of an era. This is a search for the architects of the Parthian shot, the masters of the feigned retreat, the builders of an empire that learned to rule a mosaic of peoples, not through rigid assimilation, but through a flexible, decentralized system that made it as resilient as the grasslands from which it sprang. This is the story of the forgotten horse lords, the Arsacid dynasty of Parthia, an empire that did not just challenge Rome, but created a balance of power that shaped the known world for centuries, a legacy that was not so much erased as it was intentionally overwritten, leaving behind only the faintest outline of its monumental achievement. Ours is the task of bringing this phantom empire back into the light. The world into which the Parthian idea would be born was a landscape of colossal fragments, the beautiful and chaotic wreckage of a dream of unity. The empire of Alexander the Great, that breathtaking conquest that had fused the Greek world with the ancient civilizations of the Near East, had been torn apart by the ambitions of his own generals. Out of this grand collapse, the largest and most coveted peace, the vast Asiatic heartland stretching from the shores of the Aegean to the mountains of the Hindu Kush, had been seized by one of these successors. This was the domain of the Seleucid dynasty, an empire that for a time stood as the most powerful state on earth, a military and economic behemoth ruled by a Macedonian Greek elite. It was a kingdom built on a paradox. On the one hand, it was a vehicle for the continued diffusion of Hellenistic culture, sponsoring the creation of magnificent Greek-style cities with their theaters, gymnasiums, and temples, from Antioch in Syria to Ai-Khanoum in modern Afghanistan. On the other hand, it was the inheritor of the ancient Achaemenid Persian state, a sprawling multi-ethnic entity whose diverse peoples, from the Babylonians of Mesopotamia to the Iranians of the High Plateau, possessed ancient traditions and a deep-seated memory of their own imperial glory. The Seleucid kings were forced to perform a constant balancing act, presenting themselves as legitimate Greek monarchs to their colonists and soldiers, while also attempting to adopt the rituals of ancient kingship to placate their native subjects. For a time, this delicate synthesis held. The empire was a vibrant melting pot, a world where Greek philosophy met Babylonian astronomy, but the foundation was inherently unstable. The ruling class remained a thin veneer of foreigners, separated by language and culture from the vast majority of the people they ruled. The immense distances and rugged terrain made central control a constant struggle. Satraps, the provincial governors, often acted as semi-independent rulers, and the loyalty of the diverse populations was always conditional. The empire was in a state of perpetual, slow-motion crisis, its western flank constantly threatened by the rival Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt and its eastern frontiers bleeding power and territory. It was a colossus with feet of clay, its vastness a source of weakness as much as strength. The Iranian plateau, the spiritual homeland of the former Persian Empire, chafed under Greek rule. It was a land of proud warrior traditions, a place where the old ways and the old gods remained potent. In the remote, windswept plains of the northeast, on the very edge of the civilized world, a new force was stirring, a people who had no interest in Greek philosophy or urban life, a people for whom the horse was a god and the bow a way of life. They were a storm gathering on the horizon, ready to reclaim the land that they saw as their own. On the vast, unforgiving steppes to the east of the Caspian Sea, in the lands that today constitute Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, lived a confederation of nomadic tribes known to the Greeks as the Scythians. These were a people of the horse, their entire existence shaped by the rhythm of pastoral life, a world of endless grasslands, harsh winters, and constant movement. They were not a unified nation, but a mosaic of clans and tribes, fierce, independent, and masters of a revolutionary form of warfare. Among this constellation of peoples was a tribe known as the Parni. They were a branch of the Dahai Confederation, a people of Iranian stock, speaking a language related to that of their settled cousins on the plateau. Yet, their culture was of the steppe. Their wealth was not in land or cities, but in their herds of livestock and, above all, their magnificent horses. They lived in felt tents, followed their flocks across the seasonal pastures, and were governed by tribal chieftains whose authority rested on their military prowess and personal charisma. Their society was a war machine, honed by the brutal realities of nomadic life. From a young age, every man was a warrior, trained to ride with uncanny skill and to shoot a powerful composite bow from horseback with deadly accuracy. This was their defining tactical advantage. Unlike the settled empires to the south, whose armies were built around disciplined infantry, the Parni were a fluid force of nature. They could strike without warning, unleashing a storm of arrows on an enemy and then vanish back into the steppes before a conventional army could respond. They were the masters of the feigned retreat, luring heavier, slower forces into a pursuit, only to turn in their saddles and shower their pursuers with arrows, a tactic that would one day become immortalized as the Parthian shot. They were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They did not seek to build cities or administer provinces. They sought plunder, grazing lands, and tribute. To the sophisticated Hellenistic civilization of the Seleucid Empire, they were a persistent nuisance, a source of frontier instability, dismissed as uncivilized barbarians. They were the raiders who swept out of the northern mists, a chaotic force to be managed, but never truly understood. Yet it was this very underestimation that would prove to be the Seleucids' undoing. The Parni were not just raiders. They were a people with a keen sense of political opportunism, watching the great empire to their south, noting its internal divisions, its overstretched armies, and the growing discontent of its Iranian subjects. They were a patient predator, waiting for the perfect moment of weakness to make their move, not merely to raid, but to seize a permanent foothold in the world of settled civilization. They were the raw, untamed energy of the steppe, and they were about to be unleashed upon a world that had forgotten the raw power of the horse lord. The catalyst for the birth of the Parthian state was a figure shrouded in the mists of legend, a chieftain whose historical reality is intertwined with his role as a foundational father. His name was Arsaces. He was the leader of the Parni tribe, a man who possessed a strategic vision to see beyond the traditional nomadic goals of raiding and plunder. He looked south towards the wealthy, settled province of Parthia, a region within the Seleucid Empire, and saw not just a target, but an opportunity. The moment came around the year 247 BCE. The vast Seleucid Empire was in a state of turmoil. Its king was bogged down in a costly war against the Ptolemies of Egypt on his western frontier. More importantly, the local Seleucid governor, or satrap of Parthia, a man named Andragoras, had decided to exploit the chaos. He declared his own independence, breaking away from the central authority and carving out a personal kingdom for himself. Andragoras was now a man alone, a rebel without the backing of the imperial army. Arsaces saw his chance. In a swift and decisive move, he led his Parni horsemen down from the steppes and into the province of Parthia. The rebellion he led was likely not a grand invasion, but a lightning strike, a nomadic takeover of a province already in political chaos. Andragoras, deprived of imperial support, was defeated and killed. Arsaces had seized control of a settled, urbanized land. This was a revolutionary moment. A nomadic chieftain had not just raided a province, he had conquered it. This event, the enthronement of Arsaces I, marks the official beginning of the Arsacid dynasty and the Parthian state. The early years were a desperate struggle for survival. Arsaces was not a mighty emperor, but a tribal king precariously perched on a new throne. His state was a tiny island of Parni power in a vast Seleucid sea. The Seleucid kings, once freed from their western wars, inevitably turned their attention eastward to crush what they saw as a minor barbarian rebellion. Arsaces had to defend his nascent kingdom against the full might of a superpower. He proved to be a brilliant leader, using his nomad's mobility and knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver the larger, more cumbersome Seleucid armies. He also demonstrated a remarkable political acumen, beginning the process of fusion that would define the Parthian state. He did not rule as a foreign nomad, but began to adopt the trappings of a Hellenistic and Persian monarch, styling himself a king and building a new capital. He became the symbol of resistance, not just for his Parni followers, but for the native Iranians who saw in him a liberator from Greek rule. Arsaces, I forged the identity of his dynasty. Every king who followed him would bear his name as a royal title, a constant reminder of the heroic founder. He had carved out a kingdom from the edge of an empire, a feat of such magnitude that he was deified after his death. He was the vital spark, the man who dared to challenge the world order and, in doing so, planted the seed of a new world power. The small kingdom carved out by Arsaces. I was a precarious creation, a defiant outpost constantly threatened by the overwhelming might of the Seleucid Empire, which viewed its existence as an intolerable affront. The decades that followed the initial conquest were a relentless struggle for survival, a trial by fire that would forge the resilience of the new dynasty. Arsaces' immediate successors, his brother and son, had to contend with a series of massive counteroffensives launched by the Seleucid kings who sought to reclaim their lost eastern provinces. The most formidable of these was led by Antiochus III, a ruler of immense energy and ambition who earned the title the Great for his efforts to restore the flagging power of his empire. Around 209 BCE, Antiochus marched east with a colossal army determined to crush the Parthian rebellion once and for all. He swept through the Iranian plateau, forcing the Parthian king of the day, Arsaces II, to abandon his cities and retreat into the familiar and forbidding terrain of the steppes. The Parthians, however, were not easily broken. They employed the classic tactics of nomadic warfare, refusing a pitched battle, harassing the long Seleucid supply lines, and melting away into the vast landscape. They were a phantom enemy, a force that could not be pinned down and destroyed. Antiochus, for all his power, found himself fighting a war against geography itself. He managed to reassert a degree of control and forced the Parthian king to accept his overlordship, but it was a hollow victory. The Parthians were not eliminated. They had bent, but they had not broken. Their core strength, the nomadic war machine of the Parni, remained intact. This period of subjugation was a crucial learning experience. The Parthians were forced to bide their time, to observe their enemy, and to wait for the geopolitical winds to shift. The shift came not from the east, but from the west. A new power was rising across the Mediterranean, a republic of unparalleled military and political discipline, Rome. The collision between the Roman Republic and the Seleucid Empire was inevitable and catastrophic for the latter. At the Battle of Magnesia in 19 BCE, Roman legions inflicted a devastating defeat upon Antiochus the Great. The treaty that followed was crippling, forcing the Seleucids to pay a massive indemnity, abandon their territories in Anatolia, and surrender their navy. The Seleucid elephant had been humbled, its spine broken. This was the moment the Parthians had been waiting for. The defeat at Magnesia shattered the prestige and military power of the Seleucid state. Its ability to project power into its far-flung eastern territories was terminally weakened. The Parthians, who had been patient vassals, now saw that the iron grip of their overlords had rusted and weakened. The era of survival was over. The era of expansion was about to begin. The seeds planted by Arsaces' wars, nurtured through decades of desperate defense, were ready to sprout. The kingdom of mountain and steppe was about to transform itself, stepping out of the shadows to claim the inheritance of the crumbling Greek Empire of the East. A new leader was emerging, a man who possessed the ambition not just to survive, but to build an empire on a scale his predecessors could only have dreamed of. The stage was set for the arrival of the true architect of the Parthian Empire. While Arsaces I Oscars was the founder, the man who transformed the small Parthian kingdom into a world-shaping empire was Mithridates. One ascending to the throne around 71 BCE, he inherited a state that had survived its infancy and was now poised for greatness. Mithridates was a figure of immense strategic genius and boundless ambition, a worthy successor to the Achaemenid Persian kings of old. He looked at the fractured Hellenistic world and saw not chaos, but a power vacuum waiting to be filled. His timing was impeccable. The Seleucid Empire was in a state of terminal decline, racked by dynastic civil wars and rebellions. Mithridates began his grand project of conquest by turning east, not west. He subdued the neighboring Greco-Bactrian kingdom, a breakaway Hellenistic state in what is now Afghanistan, securing his eastern flank and demonstrating his military might. With his rear protected, he turned his gaze to the rich and historic lands of the Iranian plateau. In a series of brilliant campaigns, he swept westward, conquering the vast and strategically vital region of Media and capturing its great city, Ecbatana, the former summer capital of the Achaemenid Persians. This was a hugely symbolic victory. The Parthians, once a peripheral nomadic tribe, were now the masters of the Iranian heartland. But Mithridates' ambition did not stop there. He pushed further west into the Fertile Crescent, the very cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia. This was the wealthiest and most populous region of the Seleucid Empire. In 41 BCE, he achieved his crowning victory, the capture of Seleucia on the Tigris, the great eastern capital of the Seleucid kingdom. The city fell without a major fight. Its inhabitants, a mix of Greeks, Babylonians, and Syrians, weary of the endless Seleucid civil wars, likely welcomed him as a bringer of order. The conquest of Mesopotamia was a world-changing event. It transformed the Parthian state from a regional Iranian kingdom into a sprawling, multi-ethnic superpower. Mithridates had effectively amputated the eastern half of the Seleucid Empire, seizing its economic engine and its most prestigious cities. He now ruled a vast domain stretching from the mountains of Iran to the plains of Babylonia. In a brilliant act of political synthesis, he began to fuse the disparate cultures of his new empire. He styled himself not merely as a king, but as a king of kings, the traditional title of the ancient Persian emperors, signaling his role as the legitimate successor to their legacy. At the same time, he embraced Hellenistic culture, styling himself Philhellene, friend of the Greeks, on his coins to win the loyalty of his numerous Greek subjects. He did not destroy the Greek cities, he became their protector. He even founded a new winter capital, Ctesiphon, on the opposite bank of the Tigris from Seleucia, creating a twin-city metropolis that would become the heart of Parthian power for centuries. Mithridates I was the great organizer, the man who gave the Parthian dream its imperial form. He had created a new world order, a unique civilization that stood with one foot in the nomadic world of the steppes and the other in the ancient urban cultures of Mesopotamia and Iran. He had laid the foundations of an empire that would soon come face to face with the other great rising power of the world, Rome, the empire forged by Mithridates. I was a unique and fascinating creation, a mosaic of cultures that defied simple categorization. It was a state built upon the military innovations of the Eurasian steppe, yet its administrative and cultural heart was now located in the ancient, deeply urbanized world of Mesopotamia. This fusion of nomadic heritage and settled civilization became the defining characteristic of the Parthian state. At its core, the empire's military strength remained the Parni horsemen. The Parthian army was a cavalry force par excellence, a two-pronged weapon of immense power. The first prong was the light cavalry, the horse archers who could shower an enemy with arrows from a distance, feigning retreats and leading them into ambushes. The second, and perhaps more terrifying, prong was the cataphract. This was the heavy cavalry, a warrior and his horse completely encased in scale or mail armor, wielding a long, heavy lance. A charge by these armored behemoths was like a precursor to a medieval knightly charge, capable of shattering even the most disciplined infantry formations. This combination of mobility and shock power made the Parthian army a formidable and unpredictable foe. However, this military machine now ruled over a vast and diverse population of settled peoples. In the great cities of Mesopotamia like Seleucia, Ctesiphon, and Babylon, life continued much as it had under the Seleucids. Greek remained a language of administration and culture. Theaters staged Greek plays, and philosophers debated in the agora. The Parthian kings, in a shrewd move to win the loyalty of this influential population, presented themselves as inheritors of the Hellenistic tradition. They were the new protectors of Greek culture in the East, a claim they advertised on their coinage. At the same time, they were tapping into a much deeper, older tradition. By taking the title King of Kings and establishing their court in the Mesopotamian heartland, they were consciously positioning themselves as the successors to the great Achaemenid Persian emperors. They resurrected ancient Iranian traditions and promoted a revival of Persian culture. This dual identity was the key to their success. They could be nomadic warlords, Hellenistic kings, and Persian emperors all at once, adapting their persona to suit the needs of the moment and the audience they were addressing. This syncretism was also reflected in their art and architecture, which blended Greek and Iranian motifs into a new, distinctly Parthian style. It was a civilization that looked both east and west, a bridge between two worlds. This unique synthesis, however, was not without its tensions. The relationship between the Parthian ruling elite, with their nomadic roots and feudal loyalties, and the sophisticated urbanized Greek and Babylonian populations they governed, was often complex and strained. Yet it was this very flexibility, this willingness to absorb and adapt rather than to destroy and impose, that gave the Parthian Empire its remarkable resilience and its unique place in history. It was a new kind of empire, one that was about to test its strange and powerful formula against the rigid, unbending might of Rome. The vast empire that Mithridates had conquered was a two-front state, a geopolitical reality that would define its entire history. While its expansion westward into Mesopotamia brought it to the doorstep of the Roman world, its origins on the steppes of Central Asia meant it could never turn its back on the volatile eastern frontier. The very same forces that had propelled the Parni into Iran, pressure from other powerful nomadic groups in the vast, turbulent heart of Asia, remained a constant threat. Shortly after the death of Mithridates, this eastern threat materialized with terrifying force. A new and powerful wave of nomads, known in Chinese sources as the Yuezhi, were displaced from their lands and began a great migration westward, setting off a domino effect among the peoples of the steppe. They fell upon the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, the last bastion of Hellenism in the east, and destroyed it. They then pushed up against the northeastern borders of the Parthian Empire itself alongside other Scythian groups. The reigns of Mithridates' successors, Phraates II and Artabanus I, were consumed by this desperate struggle. The focus of the empire was forced to pivot dramatically away from the west and towards this existential threat from the east. Phraates II, in a moment of crisis, even took the desperate measure of hiring former Seleucid Greek soldiers whom he had captured in a previous war to fight for him. However, These mercenaries, nursing their old grievances, betrayed him at a critical moment in a battle against the Scythians, leading to the king's defeat and death around 127 BCE. The crisis deepened. Just a few years later, his successor and uncle, Artabanus I, met the exact same fate, dying in battle against the Yuezhi. The Parthian Empire was on the brink of collapse. Two kings had been killed in quick succession. The eastern provinces were being overrun. The nomadic war machine that had conquered an empire seemed incapable of defending it from a newer, more vigorous wave of nomads. The great cities of Mesopotamia, so recently conquered, were in danger of breaking away. The grand imperial project of Mithridates I seemed destined to be a brief, glittering failure. It was a crucible moment, a test of the very foundations of the young empire. It seemed as though the Parthian state might be swallowed by the same step that had given it birth, its story ending as a mere footnote in the chaotic history of Central Asia. The empire was leaderless, its armies defeated, its confidence shattered. It was a dark age from which it seemed there could be no recovery. But the Parthian state had been forged in adversity. It possessed a core resilience that its enemies underestimated. Out of this period of chaos and defeat, a new leader would emerge, a man who would not only save the empire from annihilation, but elevate it to heights of power and prestige that would make it a true equal to Rome. The storm from the east had been weathered, but it had left the empire scarred and humbled, desperately in need of a restorer. Out of the darkness and chaos that threatened to consume the young Parthian Empire, a ruler of extraordinary ability and vision ascended to the throne. His name was Mithridates II, and he would be remembered in history as Mithridates the Great. Taking power around 124 BCE, he inherited a kingdom in absolute tatters. Its armies were defeated, its treasury was empty, two of its kings lay dead on the battlefield, and its eastern provinces were overrun by nomadic invaders. The task before him was nothing less than the complete reconstruction of the state. With incredible energy and military skill, he first confronted the existential threat from the east. He completely reorganized the Parthian army, learning the harsh lessons of his predecessors' defeats. He launched a series of brilliant campaigns against the Scythian and Yuezhi tribes, not only halting their advance, but driving them back and forcing them to recognize Parthian overlordship. He reconquered the lost eastern territories and firmly secured the frontier, transforming a source of existential weakness into a stable tributary border. He had tamed the steppe, a feat that had seemed impossible just years earlier. With the east pacified, Mithridates II turned his attention west. He re-established firm control over the rebellious provinces of Mesopotamia, crushing a nascent breakaway kingdom and reminding the powerful Greek cities of the absolute authority of the Parthian crown. He then pushed the empire's borders further west into the contested lands of Armenia and northern Mesopotamia, building a series of forts and establishing a clear line of defense. He was not just a conqueror, he was a consolidator, a man who understood that an empire needed stable, well-defined borders. But his greatest achievements were not on the battlefield. Mithridates II was a visionary statesman who understood that Parthia's future lay not just in military strength, but in commerce and diplomacy. He was the first Parthian king to fully grasp the immense potential of the network of trade routes that crossed his domain, the arteries of what we now call the Silk Road. He actively fostered and protected this trade, and the resulting customs revenues poured into his treasury, funding his armies and his court. This economic boom transformed the Parthian state. It was during his reign that the empire came into direct contact with the other great civilizations of the age. His expansion east brought him to the borders of the Han Dynasty of China. Parthian envoys were dispatched to the Chinese court, initiating a relationship built on the hugely profitable silk trade. This was a monumental moment, the first sustained, direct contact between the great empires of the Far East and the Near East. a connection made possible entirely by the stability of the Parthian state that stood between them. Even more fateful was the first contact he made with the rising power of the West. While campaigning in Armenia, Mithridates II's sphere of influence collided with that of the Roman Republic. A new global superpower was making its presence felt, and Mithridates, a shrewd and forward-thinking ruler, knew he had to understand it. He had rescued the Parthian Empire from the brink of oblivion and restored it to a position of immense power. He was the great reformer, the king who gave the empire its stable, lasting form, turning it into a commercial and diplomatic powerhouse. The world was shrinking, and the two giants, Rome and Parthia, were now standing face to face, staring at each other across the banks of the Euphrates River. A new chapter in world history was about to be written. The encounter that took place in the year 96 BCE on a tributary of the Euphrates River was not a dramatic clash of armies, but it was one of the most pregnant moments in ancient history. On one side was an envoy dispatched by the great Parthian king, Mithridates II, an aristocrat named Artabazus. On the other was a Roman official, a provincial governor of formidable ambition and arrogance named Lucius Cornelius Sulla. This was the first official diplomatic contact between the Parthian Empire and the Roman Republic, the two undisputed superpowers of their age. Sulla, with characteristic Roman audacity, arranged the meeting to assert his nation's perceived superiority. He placed his own chair between that of the Parthian ambassador and a local Cappadocian king, symbolically positioning Rome as the arbiter between the powers of the East. The Parthian envoy Artabazus, likely unfamiliar with Roman diplomatic protocol and overwhelmed by the sheer self-confidence of his counterpart, accepted this arrangement. For this perceived humiliation, upon his return to the Parthian court, he was executed. Sulla, for his part, was lauded back in Rome for his boldness, and a soothsayer at the meeting was said to have prophesied that Sulla would die at the height of his fame and fortune. Despite the ominous undertones, the meeting established a de facto understanding. The Euphrates River would serve as the boundary between their two spheres of influence. For a brief moment, it seemed that these two giants might coexist, two separate worlds divided by a clear frontier. But this was a peace born of distance, not of understanding. The Romans, with their rigid, legalistic, and expansionist worldview, saw Parthia as yet another exotic barbarian kingdom to be eventually tamed and conquered. They possessed a profound ignorance of Parthian military capabilities and political resilience. They saw a land of immense wealth and imagined an easy conquest, a final triumph that would echo the achievements of Alexander the Great. The Parthians, on the other hand, viewed the Romans with deep suspicion. They saw a relentlessly aggressive power, a republic whose endless political turmoil and the boundless ambition of its generals made it a dangerously unpredictable neighbor. They had observed Rome's systematic dismantling of the once mighty Seleucid Empire and knew that Roman friendship was often merely a prelude to subjugation. The ground was being laid not for a lasting peace, but for a century-spanning conflict, a great game that would be played out across the deserts of Mesopotamia and the mountains of Armenia. The two empires were mirror images of each other in some ways. Vast, multicultural states governed by a warrior aristocracy, but their fundamental philosophies of war and governance were worlds apart. Rome's power was its infantry, its legions, a slow-moving, methodical engine of conquest and occupation. Parthia's power was its cavalry, a fluid, lightning-fast force perfectly suited to the wide open spaces of its domain. The stage was being set for a monumental clash of military doctrines, a collision of two worlds that would define the political landscape for the next 300 years. The first handshake was over, and the long, bloody process of acquaintance was about to begin. The death of the great Mithridates II plunged the Parthian Empire into a prolonged period of internal strife and weakness, a time known to historians as the Parthian Dark Age. The strong central authority he had established fractured, and the empire was racked by a series of civil wars as rival claimants, often backed by powerful noble houses, vied for the throne. For decades, the empire was a fractured state with multiple kings ruling different regions simultaneously. This internal decay coincided with a period of unprecedented and relentless Roman expansion eastward. While the Parthian kings were absorbed in their dynastic squabbles, a new generation of formidable Roman generals, figures like Lucullus and Pompey the Great, were methodically dismantling the last remnants of the Hellenistic kingdoms on Parthia's western flank. Pompey swept through Anatolia and the Levant, extinguishing the last ghost of the Seleucid Empire and annexing Syria as a Roman province. He campaigned in the Caucasus and established Roman authority in the lands bordering Armenia. Suddenly, the buffer states that had separated the two great powers were gone. The Roman Republic and the Parthian Empire were now direct neighbors, their borders touching along the vast length of the Euphrates River. The frontier that had been a distant concept was now a militarized, tension-filled reality. The Parthian weakness during this period was a tantalizing invitation to Roman ambition. The wealth of the East was legendary in Rome, a glittering prize that could fund political careers and satisfy the boundless greed of its ruling class. The idea of a grand Eastern conquest, of recreating the epic journey of Alexander the Great, became a potent political dream. A successful war against Parthia promised unimaginable riches, a spectacular triumph, and the ultimate political power that came with it. It was in this context that one of Rome's most powerful and wealthiest men, Marcus Licinius Crassus, turned his gaze eastward. Crassus was a member of the First Triumvirate, the ruling pact he shared with Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. While Caesar had conquered Gaul and Pompey had pacified the East, Crassus, whose main achievements were his immense wealth and his brutal suppression of Spartacus's slave revolt, lacked the great military glory of his partners. He was consumed by a desire to match their prestige, and he saw in Parthia the perfect opportunity. In 55 BCE, he used his political influence to be appointed governor of Syria for an unprecedented 5-year term, with the explicit authority to wage war on Parthia. The invasion was an act of naked, unprovoked aggression. There was no casus belli, no Parthian transgression to justify the war. It was a private enterprise of plunder and ambition, launched by a man who fatally underestimated his enemy. Crassus assembled a massive army, 7 legions strong, a force of nearly 50,000 men, confident that the sheer power of his legions would sweep aside the supposedly decadent and disorganized horsemen of the East. The Parthian giant, weakened by internal conflict, was about to be struck by the full force of the Roman war machine, led by a man blinded by avarice and ambition. The collision the world had been anticipating for decades was finally at hand. The Parthian state, having finally emerged from its long period of internal division, was now united under a new and capable King of Kings, Orodes II. While Crassus was preparing his massive invasion, Orodes was consolidating his power and preparing his kingdom's defense. He understood the gravity of the Roman threat and entrusted the command of his army to a man who was not of the royal blood, a brilliant and charismatic nobleman from the House of Shorn, one of the great feudal families of the empire. This general, known to history simply as Shorena, was the architect of the devastating Parthian response. As Crassus led his legions across the Euphrates and into the sun-scorched plains of northern Mesopotamia, he made a series of fatal errors. He ignored the advice of his Armenian allies to take a safer route through the mountains, and instead chose the most direct path, a decision that led his army into a vast, featureless desert. This was terrain perfectly suited to Parthian cavalry tactics and utterly debilitating for his heavily armored, water-dependent infantry. He was marching his army into a trap of his own making. Surena, with a force that was numerically far inferior to the Roman army, shadowed Crassus's advance. His army consisted of 1,000 heavily armored cataphracts and 9,000 horse archers. To counter the Roman logistical advantage, he organized an innovation that would prove decisive: a baggage train of 1,000 camels, each loaded with a massive reserve of arrows. This ensured that his archers would have a seemingly inexhaustible supply of ammunition. In the late spring of 53 BCE, near a small town called Carrhae, Surenna decided the time was right to strike. The Roman legions, weary from their march, dehydrated and disoriented by the heat and the shimmering mirages of the desert, suddenly found themselves surrounded by a swirling cloud of Parthian horsemen. The battle began not with a charge, but with a sound, the thunderous beating of Parthian kettle drums, a terrifying, unnerving wall of noise designed to sow panic and dread. Then the arrows began to fall. The Roman legions formed their classic defensive formation, the testudo, locking their shields together to create a protective shell. But the powerful Parthian composite bows fired arrows with such force that they could punch through shields and pin limbs to torsos. The Romans could not advance, and they could not retreat. They were a static island of misery in a sea of horse archers. When they tried to sally forth, the Parthians would simply melt away, firing their famous Parthian shot as they retreated, only to return moments later to continue the relentless barrage. This was a new kind of warfare, a battle of attrition and psychological torment that the Roman military doctrine had no answer for. The legions, the greatest infantry force in the world, were being systematically dismantled from a distance. The first act of the slaughter at Carrhae had begun. The Battle of Carrhae was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a systematic, brutal execution. For hours, the Roman legions stood trapped in their defensive squares, enduring a relentless storm of arrows that seemed to defy all logic. Whenever their own supply of arrows seemed to be running low, the Parthian horse archers would simply ride back to their camel train and replenish their quivers. It was a horrifying spectacle of industrial-scale slaughter, a nightmare of endless noise, dust, and death. The morale of the Roman soldiers, men who had conquered a world, began to crack under the strain. Crassus, seeing the impending disaster, ordered his son Publius to lead a breakout with his Gallic cavalry and a contingent of infantry. Publius charged with desperate bravery, and the Parthians, true to their classic tactic, feigned a retreat. Publius and his men, sensing victory, pursued them eagerly, becoming separated from the main body of the army. Once they were lured far enough away, the trap was sprung. The Parthians turned and enveloped the isolated Roman force. The heavily armored cataphracts launched their devastating charge, their lances breaking through the Roman lines, while the horse archers circled the perimeter, raining down arrows. The force was annihilated. Publius, wounded and surrounded, ordered his own shield-bearer to kill him. The Parthians severed his head and, in a moment of supreme psychological warfare, mounted it on a spear. They rode back towards the main Roman army and displayed the gruesome trophy to the horrified soldiers and to their commander Crassus. The sight of his son's head shattered the last vestiges of Roman morale. As night fell, the Parthians withdrew, their dreadful drums echoing in the darkness. The Romans, broken and leaderless, abandoned their wounded and attempted a desperate night retreat, which quickly devolved into a chaotic rout. Crassus himself was eventually cornered. Surenna, in a final act of mockery, offered him a parley to discuss terms of surrender. During the tense meeting, a scuffle broke out, and Crassus was killed, his head and right hand cut off to be sent back to the Parthian king. The mighty Roman army had ceased to exist. Of the nearly 50,000 men who had marched into Mesopotamia, it is estimated that 20,000 were killed and another 10,000 were captured. Among the spoils of war were the sacred aquilae, the eagle standards of the legions, a symbol of Roman honor and invincibility. Their capture was the ultimate humiliation. The survivors, a scattered and broken remnant, limped back to Syria with news of a disaster so complete it was almost unbelievable. The Battle of Carrhae was more than just a military victory for Parthia. It was a world-changing event. It had exposed the limits of Roman power and had established the Parthian Empire as the undisputed superpower of the East. the only state capable of meeting Rome on the battlefield and not just defeating, but annihilating its legendary legions. The ghost of Alexander had been exorcised from the Roman imagination, replaced by the terrifying specter of the Parthian horsemen. The defeat at Carrhae sent a seismic shockwave through the Roman world. The loss of a massive army was a catastrophe, but the death of Crassus and the capture of the sacred eagle standards plunged the Republic into a political and psychological crisis. The triumvirate that had balanced Roman politics was broken, paving the way for the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. The aura of Roman invincibility, the ideological bedrock of their expansion, was shattered. In Parthia, the victory was a monumental triumph. It solidified the rule of Orodes II and elevated the prestige of the Arsacid dynasty to unprecedented heights. The head of Crassus was delivered to the king while he was attending a performance of a Greek play, Euripides' The Bacchae. In a moment of macabre theater, the actor playing the role of Agave, who carries the severed head of her son Pentheus, is said to have used the actual head of Crassus as a prop. The message was clear and chilling. This is the fate of those who dare to challenge the power of Parthia. The general Surena, the brilliant architect of the victory, was now a national hero, his fame so great that it perhaps threatened the king himself. Not long after the battle, Orodes II, likely out of jealousy, had him executed. But the strategy he had perfected had fundamentally altered the balance of power. For the first time, the Romans were forced to acknowledge an equal. The Euphrates River was no longer just a line on a map. It was a graveyard of Roman ambition, a stark reminder of Parthian might. The Parthians, emboldened by their stunning success, did not remain on the defensive. They recognized the chaos that had engulfed the Roman Republic and saw an opportunity to press their advantage. They transitioned from a defensive posture to an offensive one, seeking to roll back the Roman presence in the Near East and establish themselves as the dominant power in the entire region. In the years following Carrhae, while Rome was consumed by its own civil wars, the Parthians launched a series of major invasions into Roman territory. The most significant of these came in 40 BCE, led by the crown prince Pacorus, the son of Orodes II, and a renegade Roman general who had sided with them. This was not a mere raid, it was a full-scale conquest. The Parthian army swept through the province of Syria, capturing its great cities, including Antioch and even the ancient Phoenician ports. They pushed south into Judea, deposing the Roman client king and installing their own puppet ruler. For a brief, extraordinary period, the Parthian Empire controlled a vast swath of the Levant, its domain stretching from the mountains of Iran to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. This was the absolute high-water mark of Parthian expansion, the moment when they came closest to completely expelling Rome from Asia. They had reversed a century of Roman expansion and had redrawn the map of the world. The news of the loss of the eastern provinces was a profound shock to the Romans, who were just emerging from the bloody civil wars that had destroyed the Republic and given rise to the second triumvirate of Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. The task of responding to the Parthian threat fell to Mark Antony, the ruler of the eastern half of the newly divided Roman world. This was to be his great test, his opportunity to avenge the ghost of Crassus and to restore Roman honor and dominance. He began by dispatching a talented general who successfully drove the Parthians back out of Syria and Judea, killing the crown prince Pacorus in battle. But for Antony, this was not enough. He was a man who saw himself as a new Alexander, and he craved a victory of epic proportions. He began to plan a massive invasion of Parthia itself, an expedition that would dwarf even Crassus's ill-fated campaign. He assembled an army of staggering size, more than 16 legions, a force of over 100,000 men, including a massive contingent of allied cavalry. This was to be the ultimate Roman revenge, a war of annihilation that would finally break Parthian power forever. The grand invasion of Parthia, launched by Mark Antony in 36 BCE, was the Roman Republic's ultimate attempt to settle its feud with its great eastern rival. This was not an impulsive, ill-planned affair like the campaign of Crassus. Antony was a seasoned commander, and his force was overwhelming, a testament to the colossal military resources of the Roman world. Learning from Crassus's mistakes, he chose not to march directly through the Mesopotamian desert. Instead, he opted for a northern route, advancing through the friendly kingdom of Armenia with the aim of striking at the Parthian heartland in Media. His plan was to besiege one of the major Parthian cities, forcing the Parthian army into a pitched battle where the superior discipline and numbers of his legions could be brought to bear. However, the Parthians, now under the rule of a new king, Phraates IV, refused to play by Roman rules. They once again demonstrated their mastery of asymmetric warfare. They shadowed Antony's massive army as it marched deep into enemy territory, but they refused to give him the decisive battle he craved. Antony made a critical error by dividing his forces, pushing ahead with his main army while leaving his slow-moving siege train, which contained all the equipment necessary to take a fortified city, to follow behind under a separate guard. The Parthian cavalry, in a lightning-fast strike, fell upon this isolated baggage train. They completely destroyed the Roman escort and burned the entire siege train. Antony, now deep in enemy territory, found himself without the means to conduct a siege. He was forced to abandon his primary objective, and his campaign began to unravel. The long, arduous retreat back to Roman territory became a nightmare. The Parthian horse archers harassed his legions relentlessly, launching hit-and-run attacks, cutting off foraging parties, and forcing the Romans into a constant state of exhausting vigilance. The harsh Armenian winter began to set in, and the Roman soldiers, demoralized and short on supplies, began to succumb to starvation, frostbite, and disease. The retreat became a desperate struggle for survival, a long, agonizing march through hostile mountains and bitter cold, with the ghosts of the Parthian cavalry haunting their every step. Antony managed to extricate the bulk of his army, but the cost was staggering. He had lost more than a quarter of his entire force, tens of thousands of men, without having fought a single major battle. It was another catastrophic Roman failure, a humiliation that was in many ways more profound than Carrhae. Crassus had been reckless, but Antony had been methodical, and still he had been broken. The campaign cemented the Parthian reputation as an unconquerable foe on their home ground. It proved that their decentralized, mobile style of warfare was a perfect counter to the rigid, methodical power of the Roman legions. Antony's grand ambition to be the new Alexander ended in a frozen, ignominious retreat. The dream of Eastern conquest was dead once more, and the power of the horse lords was affirmed for all the world to see. The failure of Mark Antony's invasion marked a crucial turning point in the relationship between Rome and Parthia. The dream of outright military conquest, of a swift and glorious Eastern victory, had died in the snows of Armenia. The new master of the Roman world, Octavian, soon to be known as the Emperor Augustus, was a pragmatist, not a romantic adventurer. He recognized the immense cost and futility of trying to subjugate Parthia by force. He understood that the Parthian Empire was not a brittle, centralized state that would collapse if its capital was taken, but a resilient, decentralized entity that was almost impossible to pin down and destroy. Augustus ushered in a new era of diplomacy. He sought to achieve through negotiation what his predecessors had failed to achieve through war. His primary goal was to erase the national humiliation of Carrhae and Antony's defeat. He initiated a long and patient diplomatic effort to secure the return of the lost legionary standards. For the Romans, these eagle standards were symbols of their very soul, and their presence in a foreign temple was an open wound on the national psyche. In 20 BCE, after years of pressure and negotiation, Augustus achieved his great propaganda victory. The Parthian king, Phraates IV, perhaps wishing to secure his own throne against internal rivals and recognizing the benefits of a stable relationship with his powerful western neighbor, agreed to return the captured standards. In Rome, Augustus hailed this as a monumental triumph. He minted coins celebrating the event, built a new temple to house the returned eagles, and portrayed himself as the man who had avenged Roman honor without spilling a drop of blood. In reality, it was a tacit admission of Parthian parity. The return of the standards was not the result of a military victory, but of a diplomatic compromise between two powers who recognized each other as equals. The Euphrates River was formally accepted by both sides as the definitive border between their empires. A new world order was established, a bipolar system in which Rome dominated the West and Parthia dominated the East. The great game would continue, but its nature had changed. It became a long, simmering Cold War, a contest for influence in the buffer states that lay between them, particularly the strategically vital kingdom of Armenia. The era of grand invasions was over, replaced by a weary, centuries-long dance of diplomacy, espionage, and proxy wars. The peace that Augustus had brokered was a testament to the power and resilience that the Parthian horse lords had so bloodily and effectively demonstrated. They had forced the most powerful empire in the world to accept their existence and to treat them as an equal power on the world stage. At the zenith of its power, the Parthian Empire was a unique political entity, fundamentally different in its structure from the centralized, bureaucratic Roman state it faced in the West. The Parthian system of governance was a complex, decentralized model, more akin to a feudal kingdom than a modern empire. At the apex of this system was the King of Kings, the Arsacid monarch, who ruled from the capital of Ctesiphon. His authority, however, was not absolute. It was dependent on a delicate balance of power with a number of immensely powerful and wealthy noble families. Great houses, such as the Shurin, the family of the victor of Carrhae the Curran, and the Mihiran, controlled vast swaths of the empire as their personal fiefdoms. These families had their own private armies, administered their own lands, and often acted as kingmakers, their support being essential for any claimant to the throne. The empire was, in essence, a confederation, a collection of vassal kingdoms and noble domains, all bound by an oath of loyalty to the Arsacid King of Kings. This decentralized structure was both a great strength and a persistent weakness. Its weakness was its inherent instability. Dynastic disputes were common, and ambitious noble houses or rebellious vassal kings frequently plunged the empire into debilitating civil wars. The history of the Parthian succession is a long and bloody tale of intrigue, assassination, and fraternal strife. Yet, this same structure was the key to Parthia's incredible resilience. Unlike a centralized state that could be decapitated by capturing its capital or defeating its main army, the Parthian Empire was a hydra. Whenever Roman armies managed to penetrate deep into its territory and sack the capital at Ctesiphon, as they would in later centuries, the empire did not collapse. Power simply devolved to the great nobles in their provincial strongholds, who would continue the fight, harassing the Roman supply lines and waging a guerrilla war until the invaders were forced to withdraw. The empire could not be conquered because it lacked a single, fatal center of gravity. It was this flexible, almost amorphous political structure that so baffled and frustrated the methodical Romans. They were fighting a ghost, an empire that could absorb the most devastating blows only to reconstitute itself once the immediate danger had passed. This system allowed for a remarkable degree of local autonomy. The many different peoples of the empire, from the Greeks of Seleucia to the Babylonians of Mesopotamia and the Persians of the Iranian plateau, were largely allowed to govern themselves according to their own laws and customs, as long as they paid their tribute and remained loyal to the King of Kings. It was a model of empire built not on forced assimilation, but on a pragmatic tolerance that was a key ingredient in its long-term survival. The Parthian Empire was far more than just a military power. It was the great central hub of a newly interconnected world. Its strategic location, bridging the gap between the Roman Mediterranean and the empires of the Far East, made it the indispensable intermediary of the Silk Road. This ancient network of trade routes was not a single road, but a web of caravan trails through which the treasures of the world flowed. From the east came silk, a commodity so precious and desired in Rome that it was worth its weight in gold. From India came spices, cotton, and exotic gems. In return, the West sent glass, wine, and precious metals eastward. The Parthians controlled the vital central portion of this network, and they grew fabulously wealthy by taxing and protecting the caravans that traversed their domain. Cities like Dura Europos on the Euphrates and the great metropolis of Seleucia, Ctesiphon, became thriving cosmopolitan centers, melting pots where merchants from across the known world met to trade their goods. This immense commercial wealth funded the Parthian state, paying for its armies and supporting a lavish court culture. The Parthian elite were patrons of a unique and vibrant artistic tradition. Parthian art is a fascinating blend of influences, a testament to the empire's multicultural character. It combines the dynamism and realism of Greek art with the more static, frontal, and decorative traditions of the ancient Near East. Sculptures and reliefs depict figures in rich, embroidered clothing, staring directly at the viewer, a stylistic departure from the Greek ideal. This art reflects a society that was both a successor to the Hellenistic kingdoms and a proud champion of its own Iranian heritage. The same syncretism was evident in their religious landscape. While the ruling dynasty likely followed ancient Iranian gods and perhaps an early form of Zoroastrianism, the empire was remarkably tolerant of other faiths. Ancient Babylonian cults continued to thrive. Greek gods were worshipped in the cities. A large and vibrant Jewish community flourished in Mesopotamia, and in the later Parthian period, the first Christian missionaries began to find converts within the empire's borders. The Parthian state did not enforce a state religion, preferring a policy of pragmatic coexistence. They were not just warriors, they were shrewd businessmen and pragmatic rulers who understood that wealth and stability came from fostering connections, not from imposing a monolithic culture. They were the world's great middlemen, the guardians of the arteries of global commerce, a role that gave them a source of power and influence that was just as potent as their feared cavalry. The long peace established by Augustus and the Parthian kings was a weary one, a cold war defined by a single, intractable problem, the Kingdom of Armenia. This mountainous, rugged land was wedged between the two great empires, making it a buffer state of immense strategic importance. For Rome, an independent or pro-Parthian Armenia was a dagger pointed at the heart of its eastern provinces. For Parthia, a Roman-controlled Armenia was an intolerable threat, a forward base from which an invasion of the Iranian plateau could be launched. As a result, Armenia became the chessboard upon which the great game between Rome and Parthia was played for centuries. The game revolved around installing and supporting a client king in Armenia who would be loyal to one side or the other. This led to a seemingly endless cycle of coups, assassinations, and proxy wars. Rome would install a pro-Roman prince, only for him to be overthrown by a Parthian-backed rival a few years later. Parthia would place an Arsacid prince on the Armenian throne, provoking a Roman military intervention. This constant struggle for influence was a lower-cost alternative to all-out war, but it kept the frontier in a perpetual state of tension. The most famous and well-documented of these conflicts occurred during the reign of the Roman Emperor Nero. The Parthians had successfully installed their own candidate, a prince named Tiridates, on the Armenian throne. This was a direct challenge to Roman prestige that Nero could not ignore. He dispatched his most capable general, Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, a stern, old-fashioned disciplinarian, to restore Roman authority. What followed was a long and complex series of campaigns. Corbulo, a master of logistics and siege warfare, invaded Armenia and successfully captured its main cities, forcing the Parthian-backed king to flee. He installed a new pro-Roman ruler, and for a time, it seemed that Rome had won a decisive victory. However, the Parthians were not so easily deterred. They launched a major counteroffensive and a second, less competent Roman general was trapped and forced into a humiliating surrender. The situation had reached a stalemate. Rome could conquer Armenia, but it could not hold it against persistent Parthian pressure and a hostile local population. The Parthians could install their kings, but they could not protect them from a determined Roman military response. The eventual solution was a brilliant and quintessentially Parthian Roman compromise. It was agreed that the Parthian prince Tiridates would rule as king of Armenia, thus satisfying Parthian interests. However, he would have to travel to Rome and formally receive his crown from the hands of the Emperor Nero himself, thus satisfying Roman prestige. In a spectacular ceremony in the Roman Forum, the Parthian prince knelt before the Roman emperor, a moment that was broadcast across the empire as a symbol of Roman dominance. In reality, it was a recognition of the deadlock. The Armenian question had been settled for a time, not by a decisive victory, but by a carefully stage-managed piece of political theater that allowed both empires to save face. It was a clear demonstration that after more than a century of conflict, a rough but stable equilibrium had been reached between the two superpowers. The peace along the frontier was a fragile one, dependent on the strength and pragmatism of the rulers on both sides. In the early 2nd century CE, this equilibrium was shattered by the ascension of a new kind of Roman emperor. His name was Trajan, and he was not a diplomat. He was a soldier, a man whose entire career had been spent on the frontiers of the empire. He was also a man of immense ambition, driven by a desire to emulate the heroes of the past, most notably Alexander the Great. Trajan saw the long-standing stalemate with Parthia not as a stable balance of power, but as an unresolved problem that required a final military solution. He believed that the cautious defensive policies of his predecessors had been a mistake, and that the time was right to launch a decisive war of conquest that would eliminate the Parthian threat once and for all. He used a renewed dispute over the throne of Armenia as his pretext, and in 114 CE, he launched the largest Roman invasion of the East since Mark Antony. Trajan's campaign was, initially, a staggering success. He was a brilliant general leading a highly disciplined and experienced army. He formally annexed Armenia, turning it into a Roman province. He then marched south into Mesopotamia, following the path of Alexander. The Parthian state at this time was weakened by another of its recurrent civil wars, and its response was disorganized and ineffective. Trajan's legions swept through the Parthian heartland. They captured the great northern cities and then moved south to besiege the capital, Seleucia, Ctesiphon. The city fell, and Trajan became the first and only Roman emperor to stand on the shores of the Persian Gulf. He had seemingly achieved the impossible, succeeding where Crassus and Antony had so catastrophically failed. In the captured capital, he declared Mesopotamia a new province of the Roman Empire and lamented that he was too old to continue on to India as Alexander had done. It was the absolute zenith of Roman territorial expansion, a moment of seemingly ultimate triumph. The Parthian Empire, for all intents and purposes, appeared to be finished, its king a fugitive, its capital in enemy hands, its destiny to be absorbed into the Roman world. From his vantage point on the shores of the Southern Sea, Trajan must have believed that he had fundamentally and permanently redrawn the map of the world. But the Parthian Empire was not a conventional state, and its defeat was an illusion. The very moment Trajan turned his back, the lands he had just conquered exploded in a massive, coordinated rebellion. The great cities of Mesopotamia rose up in revolt. The Jews of the region, who had long coexisted peacefully with the Parthians, joined the uprising against the Roman invaders. The Parthian king, though a fugitive, was still at large, rallying his forces. The Roman garrisons left behind were overwhelmed. Trajan found himself in the midst of a quagmire. The decentralized feudal nature of the Parthian state, its greatest strength, had asserted itself. There was no central government to surrender, no single point of failure. The empire was a living organism that was fiercely rejecting the foreign body that had been thrust into it. Trajan, the great conqueror, was forced into a bitter and bloody counterinsurgency. His health began to fail under the strain. While returning to Rome, he died, his grand eastern adventure collapsing behind him. His successor, the Emperor Hadrian, was a pragmatist who immediately recognized the futility of Trajan's conquests. He ordered a complete withdrawal from Mesopotamia and Armenia, pulling the Roman borders back to the Euphrates. Trajan's new provinces were abandoned almost as quickly as they had been created. The Parthian Empire, which had seemed on the verge of annihilation, reconstituted itself. The invasion, for all its initial success, had been a colossal failure. It was the ultimate proof of Parthia's incredible resilience. It had absorbed the most powerful blow the Roman war machine could deliver, had been completely overrun, and yet it had survived. It was a lesson that the Romans would never forget. The dream of Eastern conquest was now well and truly dead, replaced by the sober understanding that Parthia was a neighbor that could be managed and contained, but never conquered. The empire of the horse lords had once again proven its right to exist. The 2nd century CE, which for Rome was the era of its 5 good emperors and the height of its prosperity, was for Parthia the beginning of a long, slow sunset. The dynasty had been profoundly shaken by Trajan's invasion, and though it had survived, it was weakened. The pattern of Roman-Parthian relations continued, a weary cycle of conflict and stalemate, with each successive war seemed to chip away at the foundations of the Arsacid state. In the 60s CE, another major war broke out, and the Roman armies, this time under the co-emperor Lucius Verus, once again marched down the Tigris and sacked the capital of Ctesiphon. As they returned, the Roman soldiers brought back with them a deadly unseen prize, the pathogen that caused the Antonine Plague, a devastating pandemic, likely smallpox, that swept across the Roman world. But it had almost certainly originated or been incubated within the Parthian Empire first, and it ravaged its population, weakening its economy and its ability to raise armies. The exhaustion was becoming chronic. A few decades later, at the turn of the 3rd century, the ruthlessly efficient Roman Emperor Septimius Severus launched another punitive campaign, sacking Ctesiphon for a 3rd time. Each of these invasions, even if their territorial gains were temporary, had a cumulative effect. They drained the treasury, eroded the prestige of the King of Kings, and, most importantly, strengthened the power of the great noble houses at the expense of the central monarchy. The Arsacid king was increasingly becoming a mere figurehead, while the real power lay with the feudal warlords in their provincial strongholds. The empire was slowly fracturing from within, its central nervous system failing. The bonds of loyalty that had held the confederation together were fraying. The constant warfare had not only exhausted the Parthian state, but had also fundamentally changed the Roman military. The Romans, through centuries of bitter experience, had learned from their enemy. They had gradually abandoned their traditional reliance on infantry and had adopted many Parthian tactics, creating their own powerful heavy cavalry units and recruiting horse archers from their eastern provinces. The military gap between the two empires had narrowed, and the unique tactical advantages the Parthians had once enjoyed were no longer so decisive. The empire was a slumbering giant, its wealth and territory still immense, but its political will and military edge were fading. It was trapped in a cycle of debilitating wars abroad and growing feudal anarchy at home. The long reign of the Arsacids, which had lasted for nearly 4.5 centuries, was staggering towards its end. The final blow, however, would not come from their traditional Roman enemies in the west, but from a new and unexpected threat that was rising from within the Iranian heartland itself. The final Roman-Parthian War, which took place in the 210 CE, was a messy and confused affair that symbolized the exhaustion of both empires. The Roman Emperor Caracalla, a brutal and unstable tyrant, tried to launch a new Eastern war but was assassinated before it could truly begin. His successor, Macrinus, was forced to fight an inconclusive but bloody battle against the Parthians and ultimately had to pay a massive subsidy to secure a peace treaty. On the surface, it looked like a Parthian victory. They had stood their ground and had extracted payment from their ancient foe, but the conflict was a Pyrrhic one. The war had been immensely costly, and it was the final straw that broke the authority of the long-reigning Arsacid dynasty. The King of Kings, Artabanus IV, had survived the war with Rome, but he now faced a far more dangerous threat, a rebellion in his own backyard. In the province of Persis, the ancient heartland of the Achaemenid Empire and the region from which Persia takes its name, a local vassal ruler had begun to consolidate his power. His name was Ardashir, and he was a member of the House of Sasan, a family that claimed direct descent from the legendary Achaemenid kings of old. Ardashir represented a powerful new ideology. He was not just another rebellious nobleman seeking to place his own candidate on the throne. He was a Persian nationalist and a devout Zoroastrian. He preached a revival of a purified Iranian identity, rejecting the Hellenistic cultural influences that had been part of the Parthian synthesis for centuries. He cast the Arsacids as weak, decadent, and illegitimate rulers who had allowed Iranian glory to fade. His message found fertile ground among the peoples of the plateau who yearned for a return to a more glorious, unified past. Ardashir first consolidated his control over Persis and then began to conquer the neighboring provinces, absorbing the domains of other vassal kings into his growing kingdom. He was creating a centralized, aggressive, new state within the crumbling shell of the Parthian Confederation. Artabanus IV, the Parthian King of Kings, finally recognized the mortal threat posed by his ambitious vassal. He gathered the imperial army, a grand coalition of the forces of the great noble houses who remained loyal to him, and marched south to crush the rebellion. The Arsacid dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 500 years, was about to fight its final battle, not against a foreign invader, but against one of its own subjects. The future of the Iranian world hung in the balance. The old, tolerant, decentralized feudalism of the Parthians was about to clash with the new, centralized and religiously driven nationalism of the Sasanians. The final, decisive confrontation between the old Arsacid dynasty and the rising Sasanian power took place in the year 224 CE at the Battle of Hormozd. The precise location of the battle is lost to history, but its outcome was unequivocal. The army of the last great Parthian king, Artabanus IV, met the disciplined, zealous forces of the rebel Ardashir. The battle was likely a vast and brutal affair, pitting the traditional Parthian cavalry tactics against the new, more organized and infantry-heavy model that Ardashir was developing. It was the old world against the new. The details of the fighting are sparse, but the result was a total victory for Ardashir. Artabanus IV, the last king of kings of the House of Arsaces, was killed in the battle. With his death, the central pillar of the Parthian state was shattered. The great confederation, already weakened by centuries of war and internal division, collapsed. Ardashir marched triumphantly to the capital of Ctesiphon and was crowned as the new King of Kings, but he took a different title, Shahanshah of Iran. It signaled a new beginning, a conscious break with the Parthian past. The Arsacid dynasty, which had begun with a nomadic chieftain's daring rebellion and had gone on to forge an empire that stood as Rome's equal for centuries, was extinguished. Ardashir and his Sasanian successors initiated a new chapter in Iranian history. They built a highly centralized, bureaucratic empire, the very opposite of the Parthian feudal model. They established Zoroastrianism as a powerful state church, replacing the religious tolerance of the Arsacids with a more rigid orthodoxy. And, most importantly for the legacy of the Parthians, they engaged in a deliberate campaign of historical rebranding. The Sasanians sought to legitimize their own rule by positioning themselves as the direct heirs of the glorious Achaemenid Persians of Cyrus and Darius. In their royal inscriptions and official histories, they largely ignored or minimized the nearly 500-year-long period of Parthian rule. The Arsacids were cast as illegitimate usurpers, a dark age that had interrupted the natural flow of Iranian glory. This systematic damnatio memoriae, or condemnation of memory, was incredibly effective. It is the primary reason why the Parthian Empire, for all its immense achievements, has often been treated as a mere placeholder in history, a footnote between the two more famous Persian empires. The Sasanians successfully wrote their predecessors out of the national story, creating the very phantom empire that historians have had to rediscover. The great noble families, who had been the bedrock of the Parthian system, were forced to adapt. Some, like the House of Shuran, faded into obscurity, while others pledged their allegiance to the new dynasty and were incorporated into the Sasanian feudal hierarchy, a silent testament to the endurance of the old aristocratic power. The ghost of Parthia would continue to haunt the administrative and military structures of its successors, but its name and its memory were deliberately buried. The long ride of the horse lords was over. What then is the final legacy of this ghost empire, this dynasty that ruled a vast portion of the world for nearly half a millennium, only to be written out of its own story? The Parthian legacy is one of profound and often overlooked significance. Their first and most dramatic achievement was geopolitical. They were the Great Wall against which the tide of Roman expansion broke. For centuries, they fought the most powerful military machine in the world to a standstill, creating a bipolar world order and preventing the establishment of a single, universal Roman Empire. They were the force that defined Rome's eastern frontier, and in doing so, ensured the continued development of a distinct Near Eastern and Persian civilization, preventing it from being absorbed into a monolithic Greco-Roman culture. Their second legacy was military. They perfected a new form of warfare based on the devastating combination of light horse archery and heavy armored cataphracts. This cavalry-centric model would dominate warfare in the Near East and the steppes for 1,000 years, and its influence would be felt far beyond. The Romans, through bitter experience, were forced to adapt, creating their own heavy cavalry units. The armored knight of the European Middle Ages is a distant descendant of the Parthian cataphract. The Parthian shot, the feigned retreat, these became timeless tactical concepts, a testament to their innovative genius. Finally, they were the great facilitators. Their empire was the central arch of the Silk Road, and their stable, tolerant rule created the conditions for the first great era of transcontinental trade. They were the crucial link between China, India, and the Mediterranean, a role from which they derived immense wealth and cultural prestige. They were not destroyers, they were connectors. Their unique synthesis of Hellenistic, Iranian, and nomadic cultures created a vibrant and cosmopolitan world. The reason the Parthians seem like a phantom is not that they failed, but that their Sasanian successors were so successful in their historical revisionism. They were the indispensable but unacknowledged middle chapter in the long story of the Iranian peoples. They were the bridge that connected the ancient world of the Achaemenids to the later world of the Sasanians. To look for the Parthians is to understand that a people's impact is not always measured in the grandeur of their surviving monuments or the volume of their written histories. The Parthian legacy is quieter. It is found in the enduring cultural and political divide between the West and the East, in the DNA of cavalry warfare, and in the ghostly outlines of ancient trade routes. They are the forgotten empire that held the center of the world, the silent horsemen whose thundering hooves shaped the destiny of nations. Theirs is the story of a power that rose from the steppe to challenge the gods of the city, and in doing so, created a world that was uniquely and resiliently their own.